August 7, 2020. A monsoon night in Kerala. A flight bringing stranded citizens home becomes a scene of tragedy. As the Boeing 737 approaches a rain-soaked tabletop runway, something goes terribly wrong. The result? A devastating crash. Yet 21 lives lost. What happened in those final moments? Was it pilot error, or a deadly design flaw? Let's now dive into the chain of events that led to the deadly crash of Flight 1344. August 7, 2020. The monsoon season had drenched Kerala in rain for weeks. And on this particular evening, the skies over Kozhikode were thick with gray, the air sodden, visibility limited to barely 2 kilometers. Rain beat relentlessly against the runway at Kozhikode International Airport, a known challenge for pilots, especially in poor weather. A runway on a plateau, a tabletop. At 7:40 p.m. local time, Air India Express Flight 1344, a Boeing 737-800, begins its final approach. The aircraft, tail number VTXH, is flying in from Dubai. A Vande Bharat mission repatriation flight, it carries 184 passengers, men, women, children, all desperate to return home after months stranded abroad due to the COVID-19 pandemic. 6 crew members are on board. 2 pilots with decades of experience sit in the cockpit. In theory, this should have been a routine flight. But nothing about that evening was routine. As the aircraft descends through the dense cloud layer, the rain intensifies. On board, passengers begin to fasten their seatbelts. Flight attendants walk the aisles, giving final checks. Outside, the runway is drenched, slick like glass. A runway that drops sharply into a deep gorge at both ends. There's no room for error. 7:39 p.m. Flight 1344 lines up for runway 28, but aborts the landing. Wind shear, tailwinds, poor visibility. The captain decides it's too risky. They go around. Air traffic control authorizes an approach from the opposite end, runway 10. It's a difficult maneuver. Wind direction isn't ideal. The runway is just 2,850 meters long, shorter than average, and more critically, the touchdown zone starts dangerously close to a cliff. They'll need to land precisely at the start of the runway. Any delay in touchdown could be fatal. As the aircraft approaches again, cockpit instruments detect tailwind. It's not strong enough to warrant a mandatory diversion, but enough to make braking difficult. A split-second decision must be made. The aircraft is configured for landing. Flaps extended. Gear down. Speed decreasing. Inside the cabin, a hush settles. Some passengers glance out the window, seeing nothing but gray sheets of rain. Others whisper prayers under their breath. 7:41 p.m. The 737 touches down. But not at the threshold. Not even close. It lands more than 1,000 meters down the runway, past the recommended touchdown zone. Far too deep. The engines roar into reverse thrust, spoilers deploy. The pilots slam on the brakes. But the runway is too wet. The friction, too little. The aircraft hydroplanes, sliding uncontrollably down the slope. The end of the runway approaches, fast. A sharp drop lies beyond it. 35 feet, almost 10 meters, into a gorge. 7:42 p.m. In a terrifying final moment, the plane overshoots the edge. The nose tilts downward. The aircraft dives off the end and plunges into the ravine. The fuselage slams into the earth, breaking apart into 3 sections. The nose is crushed. The cockpit is completely destroyed. Both pilots are killed instantly. The middle of the aircraft cracks open, seats rip free, passengers are thrown violently. Dust, rain, and jet fuel fill the air. Some passengers, stunned, bleeding, crawl from the wreckage. Others are trapped, their limbs pinned between twisted metal and shattered seats. Screams echo through the ravine. Some die instantly. Others, slowly. Local villagers hear the impact. Emergency teams begin to respond, but the terrain is unforgiving. The crash has occurred in the worst possible location, down a steep slope, in the middle of a rainstorm, during a pandemic. Within minutes, the airport fire services arrive, but accessing the site proves near impossible. There's no road to the bottom of the gorge. Rescuers must slide, crawl, and carry stretchers through the mud by hand. Despite the horror, many are saved. Miraculously, 169 people survive. Some walk away with minor injuries. Others are pulled from the wreckage, unconscious but alive. But 21 never make it, 19 passengers and both pilots perish. The crash of Air India Express Flight 1344 was one of India's deadliest aviation disasters in recent memory. But questions began swirling within hours. Why had the pilots attempted a landing in such conditions? Why didn't they divert? And why did the aircraft touch down so late? More than that, why was an international airport operating with a tabletop runway in the middle of a monsoon, with limited safety buffers? As the black boxes are recovered and investigators arrive at the scene, the world demands answers. The tragedy in Kozhikode was not just an accident. It was the consequence of systemic failures, some dating back decades. In the early hours of August 8, as daylight breaks over Kozhikode, the crash site resembles a battlefield. Wreckage is scattered across the ravine. The Boeing 737 lies in ruins, its broken fuselage a grim reminder of how close disaster struck to the threshold of safety. But this is now more than a recovery operation. It's a crime scene, without a criminal. The Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau of India, the AAIB, mobilizes within hours. Their task, to answer one question that now echoes nationwide. In the early morning light, investigators in hazmat suits scour the crash site. The black boxes, the flight data recorder, FDR, and the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, are among the top priorities. Despite the impact, both units are located and extracted. One, found near the tail section, the other wedged under debris from the cockpit. Charred, dented, but intact. The CVR contains the last 2 hours of cockpit conversation. The FDR logs over 1,700 parameters: altitude, speed, thrust, pitch, control inputs. Together, they hold the truth. The CVR begins, calm, professional chatter. The captain and first officer review weather conditions, alternate airports, and approach plans. Both men are seasoned aviators. The captain, Deepak Vasant Sadhe, is an ex-AF test pilot. The first officer, Akhilesh Kumar, equally competent. At 7:30 p.m. IST, ATC clears them for runway 28. But wind shear warnings light up the cockpit. Too much tailwind, the captain says. They perform a go-around. A critical decision. They request the opposite end, runway 10. Now, the black boxes show something concerning. The crew is aware of poor visibility, wind shear, and wet conditions. But they remain committed to landing. The FDR shows that during final approach, the aircraft descends at a high vertical rate. At 30 feet above ground, there's a sudden increase in thrust, indicating a flare, but it's too late. The aircraft touches down 4,580 feet down a 9,000-foot runway. Only 4,400 feet remain to decelerate. The landing gear compresses. Reverse thrust is deployed. Spoilers armed. Auto brakes activated. But the tailwind works against them. In those final seconds, the captain realizes, they're not going to stop in time. The FDR shows nose-down pressure applied to maximize braking force. But the slick runway reduces effectiveness. The aircraft hydroplanes. At 7:41 and 55 seconds p.m., the Boeing 737 overruns the runway at 84 knots, roughly 155 kilometers per hour. It plunges into the ravine. The final impact is not recorded in real time. But the data ends abruptly. Silence. The AAIB reviews training logs, rest records, and medical checks. No red flags. But in simulations, the final approach profile is reflown. Pilots tasked with repeating the same approach struggle. Each time, the runway is missed or braking proves ineffective, unless the aircraft touches down at the correct point. The report finds that both pilots underestimated the stopping distance needed, especially with tailwind and rain. The captain, though experienced, made the critical mistake of committing to a deep landing, rather than performing a second go-around. There's no sign of mechanical failure. The brakes worked. Reverse thrust engaged. Spoilers deployed. The aircraft did what it was told. The error was human. But the crash wasn't just about a decision in the cockpit. Investigators now focus on the runway itself. Runway 10 at Kozhikode sits atop a plateau, an elevated strip of land with sharp drops on either end. Known as a tabletop runway, it's already been flagged by the DGCA in earlier safety audits. But what startles investigators most, the runway end safety area, or RESA, measures just 90 meters. ICAO recommends a minimum of 240 meters. Furthermore, no engineered materials arresting system, EMAS, was installed. Such a system could have absorbed the overrun and stopped the aircraft safely. Rubber deposits, left by previous landings, had not been cleaned, reducing friction. Drainage was poor. Rain pooled across the touchdown zone. These infrastructure issues, once seen as manageable risks, now appear deadly in retrospect. In August 2021, 1 year after the crash, the AAIB releases its final report. It concludes: the probable cause of the accident was the non-adherence to standard operating procedures by the flight crew during an unstabilized approach, resulting in a long touchdown, failure to initiate a go-around, and runway overrun under prevailing tailwind and wet runway conditions. The crash leads to 43 safety recommendations. Among them, tabletop runways must undergo friction audits every 3 months. Pilots must receive tailored simulator training for monsoon landings. Mandatory diversion procedures during tailwind landings to be enforced. Runways must have EMAS or extended RISA wherever terrain permits. Airports across India, including Mangalore and Kozhikode, are now under review. Yet critics argue these recommendations echo what was already advised after the 2010 Mangalore crash, another Air India Express flight on a similar runway that ended in tragedy. In the end, Flight 1344 was not just a freak incident. It was a predictable tragedy in a system where warnings were issued and ignored. In Kozhikode, a memorial stands outside the airport gate, a quiet reminder of the lives lost. Flight 1344 brought families home, only to take 21 lives at the threshold. It wasn't a failure of machines. It was a failure to listen. A failure to change, until it was too late. It's been weeks since the wreckage of Air India Express Flight 1344 was removed from the ravine at Kozhikode. The broken aircraft is gone. The blood has been washed away by the rains. But the scars, on bodies, families, and India's aviation system, remain. The investigation has reached its end. The data has been decoded. The human factors analyzed. The reports published. But in the homes of the 21 victims, time has stood still. In a small town in Bihar, 7-year-old Arif holds his mother's phone. She was among the 19 passengers who never made it out of that aircraft. For days, he asked where she went. Weeks later, he stopped asking. In Mumbai, the wife of First Officer Akhilesh Kumar now raises their infant son alone. The child was born during the pandemic. He was flying Flight 1344 that day, his final journey. In Chennai, a nurse who survived the crash still limps. Her leg was crushed under the seat in front of her. Physically, she's healing. Mentally, the screams still echo in her sleep. These aren't just statistics. These were stories, cut short in 19 seconds. The crash of Flight 1344 was India's worst in a decade. But disturbingly, it followed a script the country had already seen. On May 22, 2010, Air India Express Flight 812 crashed in Mangalore under eerily similar circumstances, a Boeing 737, tabletop runway, deep touchdown, overshoot, fuselage breakage, 158 fatalities. That crash should have been a turning point. It wasn't. The 2010 investigation warned of poor safety buffers on tabletop runways, risks of tailwind landings, rubber deposit buildup, insufficient pilot decision-making under stress. Yet 10 years later, in Kozhikode, every one of these conditions existed again. Flight 1344 was not an outlier. It was a repetition. In the wake of the crash, the Indian Directorate General of Civil Aviation, DGCA, was placed under intense scrutiny. Media questioned why tabletop runways still operated without engineered materials arresting systems, EMAS. Why runway friction tests were often delayed. Why pilots weren't required to go around under high tailwind conditions. Air India Express, a subsidiary of the national carrier, faced hard questions. Had cost pressures overridden safety concerns? Had crew scheduling, during the pandemic repatriation effort, stretched pilots too thin? The Ministry of Civil Aviation promised reforms. Runway 10 at Kozhikode underwent urgent maintenance. Rubber deposits removed. Friction measurements recalibrated. A RISA extension was proposed. EMA's feasibility studies launched. Simulator training was updated across airlines. Pilots now train for unstable approaches, go-around judgment, and wet runway dynamics under stress simulations. The final AAIB report laid blame in clear terms. The probable cause of the accident was the captain's decision to continue an unstabilized approach, resulting in a touchdown far beyond the runway threshold under wet conditions with tailwind. But it didn't stop there. It cited contributing factors. Runway conditions not adequately mitigated. Safety audits not acted upon. Prior incident reports that foreshadowed this outcome ignored. The airport's infrastructure unable to prevent disaster. The report didn't just assign fault. It exposed complacency. It wasn't one mistake. It was a chain. A system that tolerated small risks, until they compounded into catastrophe. For those who lived, survival came at a cost. Several survivors came forward in the months following the crash. Many questioned why no evacuation orders were shouted. Others spoke of delays in rescue due to the gorge's steep terrain. I couldn't move my legs. The seat in front was on top of me, one survivor recounted. I smelled fuel. I thought we'd explode. One woman said she saw her husband's seat torn from the floor and hurled out the crack in the fuselage. He didn't survive. Others still remember the silence after the impact. That awful, unnatural silence. Followed by the rain. Some say it wasn't until local villagers arrived, climbing down the slippery slope with nothing but flashlights, that people began being rescued. The crash triggered a storm of outrage. Editorials blasted the aviation ministry. News anchors demanded resignations. Aviation whistleblowers resurfaced memos and ignored audits dating back years. And in public discourse, a hard question was asked. Are India's smaller airports safe at all? But with time, outrage faded. The pandemic wore on. News cycles shifted. And soon, for many, Flight 1344 became just another headline. But not for the families. Not for those who still limp. Not for pilots now flying into tabletop runways with unease in their gut. 1 year after the crash, Kozhikode saw changes. Friction audits became more frequent. Runway safety briefings were mandatory. Emergency rescue drills at tabletop airports were overhauled. New legislation required the DGCA to inspect RISA lengths every quarter. Pilots across Air India Express received updated simulator training, focused on monsoon handling and go-around decisions. The crash became a teaching tool in training schools. A case study in every aviation conference. A point of reflection. But many warn, reforms must outlive the memory of disaster. Because India still has 6 operational tabletop runways. Each one, a potential repeat. Flight 1344 didn't fall from the sky. It was brought down, by a series of small, tolerated risks. by an industry that sometimes flies too close to the line between safety and convenience. There were warnings. In reports. In weather. In cockpit alerts. But the warnings weren't enough. In aviation, every crash writes a new rule in blood. Flight 1344 wrote many. Let us not forget them. In the world of aviation, technology can only go so far. The last line of defense, the final gate before disaster, is always the crew. Their training. Their communication. Their judgment in the crucible of pressure. Air India Express Flight 1344 exposed a sobering reality, that even seasoned pilots, when isolated by stress and tunnel vision, can make fatal decisions. But it also revealed something deeper, that perhaps, the system around them had not prepared them enough, for that one day when everything would go wrong. The cockpit of Flight 1344 was manned by two professionals. Captain Deepak Sathe, 58, a decorated ex-AAF test pilot, had flown thousands of hours. First Officer Akhilesh Kumar, just 32, was competent and conscientious, trained on the Boeing 737, with over 1,700 hours of experience. Both respected. Both capable. Yet, when the approach into Kozhikode became unstable, neither of them challenged the plan to land. The cockpit voice recorder revealed a pattern. The captain dominated the decision-making. The first officer voiced concerns about the tailwind, the rain, but didn't insist on a go-around. There were no raised voices, no conflict. Just, quiet deference. CRM, Crew Resource Management, failed. CRM is not just about harmony. It's about assertiveness. About structured challenge. About knowing when to speak, and when to push. In that cockpit, the hierarchy remained rigid. The co-pilot, though concerned, never called for a mandatory go-around. And that silence became fatal. India's aviation sector had grown rapidly in the decade before 2020. Dozens of airlines. Thousands of new pilots. A booming domestic market. But CRM training, often mandated by ICAO, was still treated by some carriers as a checklist formality. Simulator sessions focused on manual skills, not psychological readiness. Stress scenarios like unstable approaches, conflicting cockpit opinions, or captain overconfidence were rarely drilled in depth. Cultural conditioning, especially in South Asian aviation, reinforced seniority silence, where juniors rarely questioned seniors. And in pandemic times, repatriation flights like Flight 1344 were staffed under intense logistical pressure. Modern aviation training is more than memorizing aircraft systems. It's about mental modeling, situational awareness, and split-second decision calibration. But on Flight 1344, training gaps showed. The crew opted for a landing with known tailwind, against standard advisory. The approach was unstabilized by 1,000 feet, a red flag for go-around. The touchdown occurred 1,000 meters beyond the ideal zone, with less than half the runway left. Yet no go-around was initiated, even when ground speed exceeded safe stopping distance. Why? Because training had not hardwired the muscle memory of rejection. There was no aggressive, no-go culture. Only, try and land. Flight 1344 became a case study in what happens when pilots aren't taught to abandon a landing decisively, especially when psychological pressure, fatigue, and a desire to complete the mission outweighs risk discipline. August 7, 2020 was supposed to be a happy homecoming. In the cargo hold were gifts, baby formula, letters, small bags of Dubai soil carried by workers returning after years of toil. That trip was Flight 1344. Because in the end, Aviation is not about machines. It's about people. And the people of Flight 1344 deserved better.